This is upstate New York, a few miles north of Saratoga Springs. Like many of the northern states, we're in an area that has been glaciated numerous times. As a result, we have these boulders that have been carried by the glaciers and well-rounded, and we're going to look at how to move some of them around to make sort of walls. Call them that loosely. The materials have been transported miles by the glaciers, usually, according to the geologists, less than 20 miles, but in some cases some of the rocks have been transported from great distances. For instance, the Canadian Shield was pretty well stripped of a lot of its soil by repeated episodes of glaciation, and a lot of that material was carried down and deposited here. Sorry about that, Canada, but thank you. It gives us a lot of good soil for our agriculture. The distribution of materials tends to be very uneven. This area is on the margins of the Hudson Valley. The glaciers are moving down that way, and a lot of material was deposited along the edges of the glacier as stuff washed away from the main part of the glacier. Glaciers move usually downhill. The few instances where the glacier is actually moving up a hill is because the mass of the glacier is trying to move overall to a downhill area. And as a result, most of the high areas have had all of their soil swept off, and you can go up in the Adirondacks and there will be in places very, very thin soil cover above the rocks, and the trees will grow extensive shallow root systems to try and get enough soil to get their nutrients and water supply during the dry periods. These are just some of the typical well-rounded glacial boulders that have been used to make a little bit of a retaining wall. Some of these are in the upper size for what we get in our area. The one all the way over at the bottom left is what I consider a rather interesting boulder. This one is actually a little bit rare in that it's what's called a keelstone. As the glacier was moving, many of the rocks were jumbling against each other, but occasionally a rock would get frozen into the ice at the bottom of the glacier and would be dragged along against other surfaces, be it bedrock or boulders that were locked down into the area underneath it. And you can see this smooth surface that was being dragged along, and if you look really closely you can actually see some of the grooves that were left as it scraped against some other harder rocks. So this keelstone is a fairly rare example. This example is somewhat typical of what survives a glacier. The glacier is not high energy in the sense that it doesn't have high velocities, but it is very high pressures and forces. And as a consequence, any rock that is moving around inside of the glacier tends to get all of the points worn off of it, and it becomes fairly smooth. The rocks that tend to be layered usually don't survive. The glacier will break it apart across the planes of weakness. Stones that are like shale tend to get ground down into silts and clays very easily. So what survives is not only strong rock, but it's a very tough rock in that it can handle impacts and forces without shattering. It's not brittle. So a lot of the rocks like this end up kind of like bowling balls, and they just don't stack very well. As an example of how tough they are, I'm going to toss this boulder I was just showing you against these other rocks. And as you can see, there's essentially no damage to it, just a tiny little bit of dusting where it made contact. Many of the old rock walls in this area represent more of a heap than they do a really well-stacked wall. Part of that is just the difficulty of trying to stack what are practically bowling balls. The other part is, being in a northern climate, there's a lot of frost heave. So you can't put something there that's barely stable and expect it to stay there when the ground underneath moves around and disturbs the rock wall several times over the course of a winter. So many of the walls here are just really sort of flat piles of rock, and they represent more of an attempt to get rid of the rocks so they could plow and have pasture than they do an attempt to really create a barrier. When it comes time to move the boulders, I don't try to deal with anything over 150 pounds without resorting to a cable winch. With that, I can use chain and I can drag them into position, use a pry bar to help lift them up onto the wall if I'm pulling laterally. In this case, I happen to have a convenient tree close by, so I fastened one chain about 12 feet up the tree and put the come along to it, and then I will put chain around this so that I can lift it and then swing it out and drop it into that spot. However, getting the chain around one of these very round boulders is a trick in itself. To fasten your chain around your boulder, you're going to want to make sure that you have a choker hook that can grab onto the chain itself. The next step is to make sure that you're trying to gather around the long axis of the boulder. In this case, it is running this way, so I'll want my chain to go around approximately like this, and then hook onto the tightest setting that I can get. And that's important because if you don't have it tight, it's just simply going to slide off. However, because you can only fasten it in increments as to where the chain is, it's still going to be somewhat loose anyway. So a step that is really important is to make sure that's tight by driving a wedge under it to really hold it tight against the rock. That way it won't slip off one direction or the other. And I think it's best to use a hardwood wedge rather than a softwood, because pine or something like that is going to crush too easily. So if you have some scraps of either maple or oak, those would be best. So here's a wedge of the scrap oak I have in my basement. First thing we need to do is make sure that we've got the chain centered as nearly as we can figure on the center of the boulder. Then we take our wedge, slide it in under it, and make sure the chain doesn't move by holding it with a ladder or with a hammer, and then driving the wedge in. So now we're good and tight, and we can fasten this onto the come along to move the boulder into position. Rather than struggle trying to pull what's probably a 300-pound boulder over to this spot, I'm going to take a second cable winch and fasten it to this tree so that I can pull between the two trees and vector it right down into that spot. and that's about good enough. Now I can lower it into position by reversing the winch. Slow process. Once you have the boulder in place, it's a fairly easy matter to free the chain, either because the chain isn't pinched between rocks or because you can undo the chain and then use the winch to pull it out. Before you do that, of course, you hammer the spike out, and then you do your final adjustments with the pry bar to get the final position.